Welcome everyone to the Reparative Description and Action Workshop. Today, Stephen R. Curley and Jennifer Garcon will be presenting for us. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Rare Book School, the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, Cultural Heritage Working Group, and you can see the list of the wonderful fellows who participate in this. Please check the chat for the link that will give you more information about this working group and the fellowship. We want to acknowledge all the help that we've had. A special thanks to the Rare Book School and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage, as well as Curtis Small, Barbara Heritage, Danielle Culpepper, and the former fellowship project manager, Marian Toledo Candelaria.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Stephen R. Curley, enrolled citizen of the Dene Navajo Nation, began his tenure as their Director of Digital Archives at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition in the fall of 2019. Stephen is a professional archivist who is committed to being of service to tribal community archives and museums. Stephen holds a BA in Anthropology and MA in Library and Information Science from the University of Arizona with a focus on archival practices and methodologies. He has worked with tribal governments, groups, and communities regarding the development of cultural heritage institution services, programming, and information management capacities. Stephen previously served as the chair of the Society of American Archivists, Native American Archives section, whereby he worked towards facilitating meaningful relationships between tribal and non-tribal institutions who have a vested interest in the ethical stewardship and curation of Native American archival collection. He continues this work and currently serves on the SAA Council.
Dr. Jennifer Garcon is the librarian for modern and contemporary special collections at Princeton University Library. She leads post-custodial archival projects that leverage library resources toward the preservation and conservation of community-held cultural heritage assets. She's on the organizing board of Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia and has provided digital scholarship support for the Move Archivist Archive Project, the Remember Black Philadelphia, and School Protests in Africa project. All right, we're going to turn this over to Stephen.
Yeah, so happy to be here. First off, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you all from the Twin Cities area of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, which is located on the traditional Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. Again, I wanted to extend thanks to the Rare Book School for asking me to join in this conversation today with Dr. Garcon, and to give me the opportunity to share a little bit about the work that I do with the U.S. Indian Boarding School Records Curation, where I hope to answer various derivatives of the question: how do we apply sensitive protocols to sensitive material? And the second question is, how do we present this traumatic history without further traumatizing, particularly extending that to source communities? So these questions, those two, relate to things like responsible stewardship, right? And they relate to responsible access, but they also relate to reparative descriptive practices, which is what we're here to talk about today. So I usually like to start out sort of stating the obvious. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, and making a point. But the point is, for an archivist like myself, there's two truths. And so one of them is the historic record you're so dutifully trying to curate and imagine exists elsewhere. The second truth is the historic record is written from a certain point of view. And that certain point of view often those perspectives often contradict source communities' interests that these records reference. So we'll focus on that second truth a little bit later in this discussion. For myself, a U.S. Indian Boarding School records curator, there's definitely more truths about the utility of these records and what it means for communities and the context in which these records play a part in sort of casting a light upon this sordid past. The U.S. Indian Boarding School legacy is often rife with hurt and loss. And so for us here at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, we're very much steeped in this type of work on a daily basis, and we've been doing this work since 2011 in various capacities. Some of it being in advocacy, some of it being in research, some in education, some of it part of and reliant on primary source materials exploration. And a lot of communities are becoming ready to engage how boarding schools have affected their communities, and how the records play a big part on casting light on this history. So my work, again, as a records of trauma curator, essentially, is to try to illustrate a path that shows how these records can provide healing to communities. And I don't do this alone either. Communities have taught me a lot about how these records can be used as a sort of focal point, so a focus, for making meaning making from this history. So for communities, there's definitely some awareness, that there's varying degrees of, specificity for that. But on the flip side, for the public, there's very little awareness to this history, and we're trying to change that in various educational spheres of influence, regarding curricula development, and just trying to engage more educators to make this history more known, essentially. And so, to give you a quick overview of this history of boarding schools, between 1879 and 1970s, the U.S. federal government removed thousands of American Indian and Alaska Native children from their homes and families, and placing them in assimilative boarding school institutions that were really meant to strip away their languages, identities, and cultures. And through various sort of initiatives to examine this history, one of them is the Department of the Interior's Federal Initiative Investigative Report that was published last May, so May 2022. And their findings kind of articulate this connection between education as a tactic for assimilation that also played into this larger project of native land dispossession. And so, beginning with President Washington, who's of course our first United States president, the stated policy at that time for the federal government in dealing with the quote unquote Indian problem was to replace indigenous culture with that of dominant society, or at least to sort of situate indigenous people in sort of a type of caste or a role or a status that melded with those dominant supremacist attitudes. Whoops, I'm going to take us back. I think this is a good graphic to sort of illustrate the larger sort of ideologies that inform record keeping, but also record management, and kind of plays a part in some discussions around reparative description. So supremacist attitudes, this was considered advisable in his administration as sort of the cheapest and safest way of subduing Indians, or providing a safe habitat for the country's white inhabitants. So education was a weapon by which these goals were accomplished. As you can see, these types of ideations of manifest destiny and conquest are informed by ideologies of civility, particularly Western civilization. And these carry over into propaganda of the time involving other peoples who fell under a class of inferiority. You see the Philippines there, you see Hawaii, you see Puerto Rico and Cuba. When you see these types of characters like this, I think you and I, and all of us as modern people, some of us are modern people at least, there's this sort of this insidiousness that's associated with this, and that this subhumanizing eventually leads to dehumanizing, and leads to real world policy that rationalizes the worst of attitudes, and collectively kind of devolves us as a society, right? And so again, this is not really a linear thing, but I think you get the point. So this broad sweeping policy that Native communities coped with for a century and a half, thereabouts, of being removed from your parents, being broken down with harsh and sometimes cruel tactics, and being told you were less than, having your culture disrupted, your language stripped away, severed from your connectedness to your place in this world. If you put it that way, that's a very profound type of wound that your communities experience. That's trauma there, right? And so, thankfully, with the leadership of Deb Haaland, our U.S. Secretary of the Interior for the Department of the Interior, the U.S. government has never been closer to acknowledging and taking steps to reconcile this past. And in May 2021, there's international media coverage of the location of human remains of 215 individual children at what's called the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Canada. And as you can imagine, this had deep impact, far-reaching impact on First Nations and American Indian Native communities who were starting to have more conversations about what this means to them. So on June 22nd, 2021, Secretary Haaland, again, she announced the federal government will investigate its past oversight of U.S. Indian boarding schools in the first of its kind federal initiative led by the DOI, which ultimately submitted a report, and we'll talk a little bit about that. A report was submitted in May 2022. So for NABS, we actually have played a part in this sort of process for reconciliation. And on December of 2021, we entered into an MOU with the DOI to share records and information in support of this federal boarding school initiative. So NABS continues to work with the DOI to refine our data sets around 408 schools that operated historically. And so that's for the FIBS list, the Federal Indian Boarding School list. And this list actually doesn't really represent the full breadth of the boarding school era as this list does, this graphic here that is displayed for you. For NABS, we're focusing on any institutions which remove children from their families to be inserted into an assimilationist educational setting. And this NABS list here that you're seeing is actually consists of 509 schools. So that's about 101 more than the DOI list itself. So that last graphic gave you an idea of the magnitude that our scope of work involves. And so this graphic gives you another dose of how complicated this work can be when you sort of put it in a lens of where the records are, and sort of doing like a records survey and sort of the landscape of where potential records could be. And, of course, I think we need to acknowledge our system, the National Indian Boarding School Digital Archive. So we need something powerful, right? Given that magnitude and the complexity, we need something powerful and promising that can sort of nimbly react to changes within this list and the research around that list, in addition to sort of complementing, not contradicting schema sets and other sort of divergent best practices around description that source repositories might be applying their processing and cataloging treatments to. So NIBSTA will be a presentation platform, meaning it'll make digital surrogates available and viewable. But NIBSTA will also be an aggregator, meaning it will facilitate cross collection browsability and searchability of collections from across the nation. Okay, so here's the reparative description stuff, right? So here's a definition. It sounds good, and I could take this time to tell you, you need to put brackets on everything that needs to be redescribed, in your cataloging processes. But that's the bare minimum of the work relevant to reparative description. And I think we tend, as archivists, we tend to think of reparative description as sort of confined to data fields and also managed by the archivist doing the description, right? And so my experience actually tells me that it's that plus community engagement. And so things to think about and sort of carry over into this work is records are created from a certain point of view. And so, there's always concerns about too much content without much context around it. These records are largely administrative, and they sort of codify things sort of within this lens that these children being taken from their families is justifiable, right? And so there's always language that never contradicts that. That was a need by the federal government to do. And so the second thing here is research is not just research. We've had some community members participate in community researchers programs that we've devised, which kind of equipped them with standard research practice and gave them early access to NIBSTA, for which their work involved producing a report of their findings. And this report was ultimately shared at a community event where family members and council people were present to sort of listen in on people's process with developing their research questions and navigating the records, and seeing whether or not their questions were asked, or if it led to other unanswered questions. The community researchers' feedback when we were in that session with the community was, we're not really doing just research. It's something more profound than just research. And so the third thing there that's kind of related to research not being research is we have to change the way we think and talk about the subject matter, right? And so we also have to do this sort of how we're talking about the work as well, because we operate within a sort of Western normative worldview now, and it's also part of what Indigenous people are trying to actively decolonize, right? And so the fourth and last point there is the only way to do this is to include more community opportunities for interpretation of that historic record. So we need to continue to facilitate and uplift the voice of the communities to talk back to the historic record. And so we can sort of start to suss out specific events that are true and happened, but in surfacing them, they ultimately become sort of discussion centerpieces, because community members, this type of description or sort of reparative description is very liberating. And an example of that is maybe having access points regarding discipline and punishment. A lot of kids were disciplined and punished for an arbitrary set of desired behavior. And so the events that took place around that is up to interpretation. And students who are sort of seen, and I'll probably show you an example, students who are seen as running away, students who are seen as destroying property, that can probably be interpreted as resistance or defiance, right, to this larger system of child removal. So that ultimately means you have to know your audience, particularly as it relates to source communities. So here's a little bit more work about how we're trying to develop a lexicon, a vocabulary of being able to speak about this work. Is there is a working group that NABS was successfully able to put together, consisting of various other similar digital projects who do curate U.S. Indian boarding school records. And in our discussions, it's starting to become more apparent that establishing access points are going to play a key role in just, and not just how future data contributors are going to apply their descriptive treatments, but also in how users of the system will sort of conceptualize and abstract their understandings of the boarding school landscape, and serve as indicators for what these general subject areas within the NIBSTA data curation environment are. And so part of that work was just kind of surveying what current sort of tags, or whatever you want to call them, access points, subject headings, were being applied to NARA records, because as you saw in that earlier map graphic, the lion's share of the records exist at federal repositories. And so for the longest time, the federal repositories have been assigning access points to these records. So we've compiled and examined and distilled over 600 known keyword and topical access points sourced from NARA's catalog. And some of them were irrelevant terms, which we kind of discarded, leaving them out of sort of the data sort of curation environment. But it still led to ample discussion, and the goal is to work towards establishing a shared lexicon for cataloging records, as well as ensuring cross-collection browsability for these different aggregation contributors. Oops. Let me go back. So another sort of drilling down further into that survey involved compiling all known access points currently being leveraged by working group partners. And so in total, I think it amounted to like 346, something like that, known access points, which were topically oriented. And so you'll see here that it's sort of color coded as green. So that's the topical or subject heading oriented access points. And although these access points were developed by situational context, meaning like our partners at the Carlisle Dickinson College project, their access points are designed for the Carlisle context, right? And so for, again, our partners at the Genoa Indian School project, their access points were curated for the Genoa context. And they do prove to be a good starting point for NAVs, but to determine which access points it could deploy and sort of applying that in a macro nationwide platform, we had to discuss. And so collectively, we want to again determine the breadth and use of these established points, which will ultimately result in a first of its kind. What we're kind of referring to as the U.S. Indian Boarding School Records Access Points Controlled Vocabulary Dictionary. So it's a dictionary that we're sort of working towards. And so I mentioned resistance, and this is just a slide sort of showcasing what these types of records look like and sound like. But there's indicators of something going on other than what is normal. And with hindsight, we can build trends on subject matter. So we're starting to see stuff like anthropologists coming in to the schools and sort of using the children as resources to sort of mine and build their careers off of what the kids are telling them, essentially. That's probably something we should start to sort of cultivate as a subject area, right? So that's kind of reparative in and of itself. There's other sort of situations where there's maybe gender politics, pay gaps. So a lot of the time students went into what's called an outing program, which is sort of outsourced labor to local families, in and around the proximity of the schools. And sometimes we're seeing that the girls versus the boys were being paid less. And so we're kind of seeing like these sort of Western sort of models and value systems being sort of instilled into how these children had to go about their lives at these institutions. Another reparative descriptive thing that we have to deal with is, the legacy data. So Digger is kind of prominent in some records in the Great Basin area. And as you can see here, it's applied to a student case file. And the term digger, as you'll see here in a contextual note, is what was applied historically to many different communities in the Great Basin area, and it is considered derogatory language. So we want to contextualize that but we also don't want to, this is kind of where we have to walk the fine line of repurposing, unfortunately, that information, even though it's wrong and it's hurtful language. It's still part of the record, and these records were organized in a certain way, and there's utility and sort of maintaining that sort of consistent arc of sort of exploration, I guess, if you want to call it that. Another piece that I think is probably restorative versus reparative, and I think I do have a slide on restorative description, but you know, we're wanting to make sure that within this landscape, this ecosystem of information, that we're involving the contemporaneous tribal nations who relate to these records. And so for NIBSTA as a data repository, we're mindful that we need to relate these historic records to the contemporaneous tribal nations whom these archives relate to, and to also facilitate more sort of interaction or interfacing between people who are engaged in the records and the tribal nations as well. So this is hopefully we'll see more of that as the system becomes live. So I'm going to speed it up here just a little bit. With that last slide regarding restorative description, we wanted to make sure that tribes had an opportunity to talk back to the historic record, things that they were seeing. And so there was a project that we completed last year where it would consist of community information sharing sessions, letting the communities essentially know, like, this is what we're doing, this is what we're scoping out. Do you have any suggestions, right? And so we were active in sourcing that feedback from communities all along the way as sort of like an evaluative benchmark within the project. We also had what I mentioned before, community research workshopping. We also produced oral history type of video, which hopefully you'll be able to see in later on in the breakout group discussion. But we also digitized Pipestone Indian School records. And so for that community research goals, I think a lot of it had to do with, you know, rebuilding or reclaiming this sense of connectedness with each other. So, you know, they ask questions: did they contact parents to get their children back home, or did they die there at the school? Other questions related to you know, I need to understand the domino effect across our reservation, and I have learned to help others conduct research later. And some of the community reflections that I think are worth noting and we're sharing with you all is that you know, I think this research process can be draining, but ultimately it's vital for us. Each and every one deserves to be read and known and held. I felt upset that as a family, we were not talking about our relatives attending these schools. So again, looking back at our reparative description, things to think about, you know, records created from a certain point of view. Research is not just research. We have to change the way we think and talk about the subject matter and involving communities in that process. You know, this is where we have to sort of be careful as archivists not to be full on anachronistic when we're applying our modern sensibilities onto the past. Sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes it's a stretch, and that's what historians have been doing this entire time, though, is interpretation. And so for us archivists, I think we're sort of venturing into this this kind of new area of practice. And of course, you know, we should be, but we should also, you know, situationally do so and be careful as we're doing it. And so what I've showed with to you regarding, you know, boarding school records curation, I think there's indicators of all kinds of that kind of thing that needs to be cultivated regarding subject areas. But looking at what we covered, hopefully you all have a better understanding that there's meaning to these records for communities. And I've been fortunate to bear witness to how some of these records can provide, or can at least provide, a type of healing. And because of that, it's restorative, right? So thank you very much. And I just wanted to maybe give you a heads up that in the breakout session, we'll maybe take a look at a demo of the NIBSDA system, in addition to looking at the voices of Pejuta Zizi Oyate, which is that idea of talking back to the records, talking back to the historic narrative that's accepted. So I'll just leave it there, and I'll pass it back to the coordinators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was so powerful. We're going to go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer Garcon. So Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and get situated, we're ready for you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to be in conversation today. And Stephen, for your wonderful and powerful presentation. I think that there's certainly some overlap in the things that we'll be talking about, or I'll be talking about today. So we gave a bit of an introduction, but just as a reminder, my name is Jennifer Garcon. I'm the librarian for modern and contemporary special collections at Princeton, where in addition to caring for and curating 20th century rare books and manuscripts, I've been attempting to develop a post-custodial strategic partnership between the library and cultural memory institutions, with the intention of broadening preservation capacity at both the institutional, the community, but also the personal levels. I'm here today representing Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, A for BLIP for short, which is a loose organization of archivists, librarians, and allied professionals in the Delaware Valley region who are responding to the issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement and Jared Drake's call for action. So our work has since really been aimed at trying to advance anti-oppression and anti-racist values within our profession, and particularly within our region. So I joined A for BLIP about 2018, so shortly after moving to the Delaware Valley region, and have since been really working to support Philadelphia area communities of color in particular, preserve and conserve their historical records and items. And I see that kind of intervention as being trying to find ways to leverage the institutional resources that I have at my disposal, and that my A4 colleagues have at their disposal, to extend the life cycle of materials without taking physical custody of those items. As just a bit of background, I'm a historian of radio and grassroots social movement in the Caribbean. And so for me, archival invisibility in particular, particularly for those that fall outside of traditional collecting scopes, has been a major concern in my academic work. And that has really animated how I think in terms of my professional work as well. So Philadelphia is a really interesting place to be doing this work, in part because of its deep historical significance and just the sheer volume of cultural heritage and cultural memory institutions that are here. When I first moved, I was fairly knowledgeable about Philadelphia's colonial history, the founding fathers, all that jazz, but soon learned that there was a lot more that I needed to know. So as I learned and was quite surprised by, Philadelphia is the 6th largest metropolitan city in the US. And according to the most recent census reports, 42.9% of its nearly 1.6 million residents identified as Black, whereas over 64% of residents identified as being persons of color. That has since changed, though it has increased as a result of the pandemic, and an increased movement from places like New York and Boston into the city limits. So the city is also, I was surprised to learn, experiencing rates of gentrification that surpass San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, many of the kind of poster children for this kind of demographic movement. And these processes in particular are really endangering some of the the processes of displacement rather have endangered racial and socioeconomic demographic shifts within the city. And as a result are really threatening some of the existing cultural and social practices of places that have deep historical and cultural significance to marginalized communities in the city. And you can really see that just by walking around. A brief walk through the city really lays bare the realities of gentrification, wherein legacy educational institutions are being sold at auction, wherein religious institutions are being turned into luxury lofts with marketing campaigns that allow you to, quote, live in a landmark, and where the country's early Black religious institutions, including the first African Baptist church founded in the 1830s, is retrofitted to be a luxury vacation rental. And so I want to make note of a couple of things. The work that AFRBLIP is doing is really kind of rooted in existing work that's happening in kind of the broader Philadelphia community, particularly among artists, activists, and activist academics who are leading initiatives that are really trying to combat this long form erasure. Projects like Disappearing Blackness and the Middle Passage Project have sought to highlight the long legacy of forced movement of people of color and the ways in which some of the sites of historical significance to African Americans in the city are casualties of this shift. They're foregrounding really critical questions about what the future of Philadelphia looks like and are calling for intervention to secure and save the city's Black history. So the reality, I think, is that while communities of color are facing various forms of erasure, we in the archival spaces are having these conversations about representative gaps within the archival record, but fail to connect and redress some of the ways that our own institutional practices both facilitate the erasure that we're talking about and the archival silences that we're hoping to plug. And so as a result, in the Delaware Valley region in particular, our existing institutional archives can tell us a lot more about Ben Franklin's Philadelphia and considerably less about the Philadelphia from the 80s and 90s. And so without intervention, this more recent Philadelphian past, particularly those that center Black and Afro diasporic peoples, Latinx folks, migrant communities, et cetera, will just be lost. And so as a member for AFRBLIP, one of the things that we're thinking seriously about is how well-resourced institutions can play a part in supporting and amplifying the visibility of unique cultural heritages in ways that foreground social justice, that redefine relationships between institutions and their neighbors, and reframe success as mutual growth and capacity to preserve historical materials within a broader decolonial framework. And in this regard, again, as I mentioned, we're really influenced by Jarrett's work and his call to action to think critically about the archives erasure, in particular of Black lives. And so what we've been doing is looking for avenues of intervention at the local and community level via some of our community archiving work. And also at the structural and institutional level with the production of the anti-racist description resource shown here, which aims to remedy as much as possible the harm caused in the archive. And so with particular significance, I want to give credit where credit is due. I was not a part of the drafting of this particular document, though I have used it and also worked with AFRBLIP in terms of the outreach for doing this work. But I do want to make sure that I credit my colleagues, Alexis Antrocoli, Annalise Bordini, Kelly Bolden, Faith Charlton, and Amanda Ferrero, who are deeply involved with the production of the anti-racist description guides themselves, which have been a really, I think, an intervention in the field that really thinks about the ways in which harm can be caused by racist language, dismissive and otherwise erroneous description, and how this frequently appears in archival collections having to do specifically with marginalized people, and is thinking about where at the institutional level intervention is necessary, but how to do that through engagement with the individuals that are actually represented in the collections themselves. And so for the purposes of this paper, I'll share a little bit of our community archiving partnership work, and talk through some of our process and our praxis in seeing some of this reparative work, this work of re-leveraging resources, and kind of realigning power via resource sharing, how it appears in the world. So I'll start with Remember Black Philadelphia, which is a multimodal digital scholarship project that endeavors to address some of the concerns that I brought up previously, right? It hopes to advance a version of Philadelphia's future that's rooted in its past and is in direct opposition to some of the language of urban renewal that's being deployed by developers currently. So it was started by a professor at UPenn, Crystal Strong, and the project involves a community archiving component that seeks to support the archiving and preservation of cultural heritage materials held by individuals in historically Black communities around the city. Within the praxis of the project, Black Philadelphia is not one singular space, but is rather a racial, spatial, imaginative construct that indexes both the memories and the lived experiences of Philadelphians who identify as being of Afro or Afro-diasporic descent. And so I've walked us through the slide, kind of shows a little bit about the purpose and praxis of the work that Remember Black Philadelphia does. And it's particularly drawn to the question of, in the face of gentrification, what does it mean to occupy space, to declare one's presence, to enact a sense of ownership over the city. And one of the ways that the project really endeavors to do so is through kind of robust and multimodal storytelling that allows folks to capture endangered spaces through oral histories, through annotating existing descriptive information that essentially give context to the process of these transitions, to using crowdsourcing as a way to digitally reassemble some scattered institutional records. And the notion is that we would extend access to preservation resources and expertise, and importantly, work with communities to apply for and seek continued grant fundings using the kind of infrastructure of the university that we have access to. In the process of doing this work, we've engaged with many different kinds of communities. I'm always a little fraught using the term community in this kind of blanket way. But one of the things that we sought to do was to work with different kind of self-identified communities in Philadelphia, and really provide resources to support the ongoing work that we understood to be happening there in terms of preservation and documentation of their historical kind of residence, especially given the nature of increased development in the area. And so how we do that is by coordinating access to digitizing equipment, providing one-on-one consultation on item preservation with archivists and library professionals, using the resources at our disposal to give out archival quality folders and item sleeves, and importantly, leaving people with a digital surrogate of the physical item, understanding that in situations like these, there's a particular precarity, um, especially as people are being forced out of their homes of 20, 30, and 40 years because of predatory practices. And the idea in large part is thinking about and asking the question, what would it look like to develop an alternative archive, right, outside of institutional structures that challenges the erasure of gentrification by using kind of the open source digital infrastructure that we have access to recreate a kind of vibrancy of place. It's thinking, what would it look like to find enough photographs and enough documents and collect enough oral histories that could provide context to the feeling of living in West Philadelphia in the 80s or in the 90s. And so we've really engaged this work via a number of pilots that think about creating resources and think about instituting kind of a structure of how we as AFRBLIP might work with community partners toward a project end. This in particular is a community data curation project that initially embeds shared action, accessible resources, and easily reproducible infrastructure into its strategic design. We were able to fund this via a CLEAR grant and built 3 portable digitization stations that could be brought into community spaces to support the digitization of family records. It's a really lightweight structure. Again, AFRBLIP is largely a volunteer-based organization. And so as we have individuals who are available, we can expand outward or contract depending on need. But it works fully running with about 3 to 4 people to operate various clinics. And we often choose to do these clinics in third spaces. So either at free libraries, in museums, in church spaces, as a way to engage community, but in full recognition of some of the vexed historical relationship that our institutions as places like Princeton and Penn and Temple, for instance, have with the communities that surround them. In the last few years, we've done about 3 or 4 of these a year in partnership with, again, these third spaces, including one-on-one partnership that allowed us to digitize or to create a newspaper archive pertaining to Black Muslim life in Philadelphia. And so I'll go through a little bit of what the work kind of looked like on the ground. It's in full recognition that the items and the records held by communities, and particularly family records, are rich historical sources. But they're also telling the story not only of individuals and of friends, but allowing us in some really concrete ways to tell the kinds of collective stories that we imagine of a community and its various institutions. Oh, I think I moved too quickly, but you guys kind of get the gist of all these wonderful photographs. We've set up a workflow in order to do this. Part of it included working with archives professionals to create essentially a Google form to help collect metadata at these community events. The intention is to draw out some of the connections between the individuals, the communities, and the institutions. Again, thinking about this question of how one might visually represent a space for which existing archival repositories have either ignored or that for which there isn't robust data. And the notion is to create that robust data, right, in a way that thinks about the cultural record contemporaneously and seeks to plug it at the time. We're really focused on finding ways to make this cost effective and to alleviate cost burdens. This is in part why having these digitization stations and providing full access to the archival materials and items while doing this is particularly helpful, but it also lends into the different platforms that we've chosen to work within. So we use widely available resources like Google Forms, like open source platforms, Jekyll and GitHub, in large part because as a community-based project, we don't want things stuck behind a paywall. And while we've talked a little bit about what it looks like to provide financial support for more proprietary software, I think in terms of sustainability, it just seems to make more sense to go for a widely accessible and free to use option, such that the relationship, the asymmetrical relationship that often pans out between communities and universities, there's a way to kind of we want to give as much autonomy to community and community partners to cut out and leave with their items in hand should they decide that they no longer want to pursue a partnership, which is that kind of ability to make decisions and decision making and have that be fully independent of access to resources was important in our thinking. And so one of the things that's really interesting about this form and the way that it's engaged is that it allows us to collect metadata about each item. Often these are photographs, ephemera, and documents. It's flexible enough to allow participants to incorporate multiple names and locations, understanding that one person or place might go by various names. So trying to overlap and produce kind of a network data approach to kind of mapping out what this looks like. And it also provides contextual description of an event or place. We've in the past experimented with oral history collecting at these events as well, which is really thinking about how to, in perhaps one photograph, create as robust as we can descriptive data in a way that incorporates and kind of fleshes out the intentions of the project. In collecting the data, I got lost. Okay, embedded in the Google form at various levels are questions having to do with privacy and permissions that allow our community members to submit photographs and documents anonymously or not at all. We also have takedown notices that allow community members to either change their mind at any point in participating with RBP. And over time, we found that the best practice has been incorporating everything into a singular document and using kind of the automatic share function in Google Forms to make sure that we can stay connected with the community member who has very generously offered us a digital surrogate of their item for use in this particular project. And so our hope, and one of the things that we've been playing around with is finding a way for the Google form to create the kind of robust data set via a spreadsheet to then generate a digital archive using minimal computing platforms that allow the development of community curated alternative archives. If we're thinking about digitally recreating vibrancy and challenging erasure, this is one of the outlets that we're imagining doing so in. I think I'll speed a little bit through this one because I do want to give us some time in the breakout rooms. But I did want to walk us through one other project that we're a part of, which is with the MOVE organization. So MOVE was a Black Power organization that in the 1970s and 80s experienced extreme repression at the hands of the city and state officials, culminating in the 1985 MOVE bombing, in which Philadelphia PD dropped 2 explosive devices on the roof of an occupied residential home, killing 11 people, including 5 children. They let the fires go unextinguished, which later destroyed 2 city blocks and rendered over 250 people homeless. So I was really surprised how fairly obscure this history is in Philadelphia. It's known by long-term residents, but is not much talked about, especially given the nature and the volume of transplants here. And so we've been working with the Move Activist Archive, which is a collaboration between AFRBLIP, Remember Black Philadelphia, and the Move organization. And this is many years in the making. It started with conversations between myself and Crystal Strong and Mike Africa Jr., who is a direct descendant of the Move organization and the organization's historical griot, who really wanted to engage us in figuring out ways to meaningfully preserve Move's historical memory. So this project in particular required a lot of time upfront and relationship building, some cross-institutional partnership development that ultimately drew in nearly half a dozen institutions that would pool resources, space, and expense to try to do the work that both respected Move's goals and boundaries vis-a-vis their archive and its preservation, yet also sought to provide preservation and post-custodial support for those historic materials. And so here you're seeing kind of the template for a finding aid that we developed for these engagements with Move. They had something like a basement full of archival records in the kind of plastic tote bins that Mike himself had rescued from one that his grandmother rescued from the remains of the home. So there were some fire singed items that were there, but also from family members and other Move members over the course of a number of years. And so we as AFRBLIP worked within our broader member networks to secure archival supplies to redistribute at these processing events, to develop a metadata and processing workflow for tracking and developing a database of archival content, for developing an MOU for equitable partnership building. And the idea is that we would create a workflow that is reproducible and scalable with some training, such that the organization can do this work outside of the events that they have with Move. So the work is ongoing, whether or not we are in the picture. So we hosted a few of these events this past summer when it was a bit warmer. Also at a third space outside of the university structure, in full recognition of kind of the fraught relationship between Move and West Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton. And so it really was a grassroots effort that had immediate and long-term benefits for both groups. So I'll kind of move really quickly through these. Working with Mike and other Move members to process some of these collections, get them into the finding aid, and then also partnering with CCAHA fellows to provide conservation support to the fire damage items on site. So I'll leave it there to allow more time to discuss in detail what it looks like to do some of this work in practice in the breakout rooms, but also for questions, should there be any.
There was one for Jennifer. Is the form used for community digitizing events included in the resource links above?
No, it is not, but I can surely include it. It's incredibly adaptable since it is a Google form. So I'll share it as a copy and you guys can feel free to adapt it as you wish or kind of go through the process to see how well it might work for your particular circumstance.
Yeah, so there's a question from Annie Tang. She said, oops, hold on, I lost the question. She said, can that inventory be converted to an EAD spreadsheet and later imported to ASpace?
I believe that it can, in large part because the the AFRBIP colleague that worked on the spreadsheet, Faith Charlton, works here at Princeton with me, and I know for sure that we use ASpace. And so I think that was kind of the framework for the initial inventory. So I wouldn't be surprised if it can be imported, but I'll ask that really quickly, should you guys want to know that firmly.
So we have another question for Jennifer. Have you had any requests for usage of material from Remembering Black Philadelphia project?
So we have not gotten, I think, far enough to have a corpora that would be that would get to that point. I'll say that we imagined, so two things. We were very clear in terms of permissions about what our intentions were with community members who we were working with. We made sure that it wasn't a precondition that to speak to an archives professional to talk about your item, to get it preserved. It didn't need to end up on this digital archives space. I would say that I imagine the space as being largely for community use, however, whatever that looks like. But I'll say this based on some of the work that we have done previously with the same professor, school protests in Africa, that has been a pretty robust source of research-based inquiry since its publication. I think given the nature of the scarcity of items like this in traditional repositories, I imagine that there might be the same interest ultimately, but as of right now, it's not shared widely, so we can't say for sure.
So question for Stephen. When is this lexicon going to be complete, and how will it be made available to other institutions?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for the question. So NIBSDA itself it's not live right now. We're sort of in development stages, and one of the things that is going to be coupled with its release is like a contribution guide, because we're anticipating that there's going to be interest from various source repositories who have boarding school relevant collections, who might want to engage us in sort of a data sharing sort of agreement or arrangement. And so, that'll be also part of that contributor guide is the MOU itself, in addition to other things like a CSV template, like the lexicon itself, and sort of like other preferences that we have, and sort of entertaining any prospective agreement that might come in the future. So that will be made available upon NIBSDA's launch. Thank you.
Looks like we have a bunch of questions starting to come in. The next one is from Curtis Small. It looks like it's for both, but possibly a little bit more for Jennifer. Do you have thoughts or reflections on the fact that many archivists who want to do this type of work struggle in contexts that are not well resourced, or where there is not administrative support for this kind of important work?
Yeah, I think, I think that this is certainly a challenge. When I started doing this work at Penn, I was doing it as a postdoc. And so I too didn't have a ton of administrative support, and really kind of like struggle to figure out a way to do it with the resources that I had, given the nature of my contingent position at the university itself. I will say that part of the exercises that I have planned for the breakout room are asking us to think about what we have in terms of resources regardless, how we might be able to pool resources by finding like allies, not only at our institution, but perhaps in our city or further out, as a way to build not only sustainability, but also additional support for the work that's being done. I think that there are different levels of intervention that are possible. And so figuring out exactly where you are and what you have to leverage can help scope out the size of project that you're able to do. But in large part, a lot of communities are, and community organizations, I find, are already fully engaged in this work. This work is already ongoing. And sometimes it's as simple as having, the letterhead that can support them in a grant application, which is one way to leverage our institutional positionality in a way that supports, even though we might have copious resources or copious time to do so. But yeah, I'm excited to kind of talk to everybody about where they are and what their positionality is, and to think through what it might look like to do something similar, either individually or in partnership with one another vis-a-vis this group.
Great. Yeah, I'd like to throw in my 2 cents into that question. I was looking at that question too. And when I see resources, I think of dollars, because this important work that both Jennifer and I are, and some of you all in the call are trying to complete and fulfill. It's sometimes costly, to do. And so I know a lot of you might be in sort of a university sort of settings where there's a lot of bureaucracy to sort of deal with, and advocacy for your programs. You kind of need to lean into and speak up, and ultimately, you kind of want to take a look at your budgets, and your budgets are kind of they're documents that sort of indicate where your value system for your institution is, and so those are ethical documents, and so you want to continue to advocate for your programs. A lot of this reparative work in the archives profession is being supported now with things like the protocols for Native American archival material. There's now a social mandate to work with community. And so that's part of practice now. And so that's a standard. And so, this work absolutely needs to be funded and financed so that we do this successfully.
Welcome back to the main room. All this was too short for all of us. We want more. I just want to see if there's anything else that we need to take care of. Want to make sure that we thank Jennifer and Stephen for their great presentations, and would also like to remind everyone before we close out, if they could answer our survey. It's very short, so you'd be able to finish it right before it closes out. And I'd like to thank again all the members of the cohort from the Railroad School, Mellon Fellowship, Cultural Heritage and Diversity for their time and their input in creating this great workshop.